Hello! All right. Now, before we dive into the code, before we start building Node applications, we need to talk about how Node was born. But in order to talk about how Node got started, why it's so big, why it's everywhere, and why you need to learn it, well, we need to ask this question. How do you run JavaScript? Pause and think about this. How do you run JavaScript? If I told you, hey, run this piece of JavaScript code for me, how would you do it? Would you be able to run JavaScript on any computer? Let's say you bought a brand new computer. Can you run JavaScript on it? Well, for some of you, your first answer might be, well, yeah, I can run it in the browser. If we go to our browser, let's say you're using Google Chrome, Firefox, whatever. You can open up the developer tools and you can run JavaScript in your console, right? But the thing that's running JavaScript for you here is not your computer. I mean, yes, it's your computer, but it's the browser that you downloaded or came pre-installed on your computer when you bought it that allows us to run JavaScript. If we had a fresh computer with nothing installed, well, JavaScript would be meaningless to the computer, right? I mean, that's what programming is. Programming, such as using a programming language like JavaScript, is us, as programmers, writing instructions so that a computer, a machine, follows those instructions. And the way a browser, or we're able to run JavaScript, is by writing JavaScript, and then we feed it into something like this. Now, what this is in this 8, well, we call that a JavaScript engine. We're going to get back to that shortly. But we essentially write instructions so that our machines do something with those instructions. In our case, maybe have interactivity on a website. But in order for us to be able to run JavaScript, we need this thing right here. We need a way for a computer to understand JavaScript. And this is what a JavaScript engine does. When we download, let's say, Google Chrome, it comes in with a built-in JavaScript engine. This JavaScript engine takes whatever we write over here and understands it and runs the code for us. But can we run JavaScript without a browser? How would you run JavaScript outside of a browser? I mean, we just talked about how we need this piece, this JavaScript engine, in order for a computer to understand the instructions that we write. So how can we use this engine, but without a browser? Is that even possible? Well, let's do a quick Google search here. If I type in JavaScript engines, maybe I can use a JavaScript engine on my own instead of the Chrome browser one. Well, as you can see here, a JavaScript engine is a computer program that executes JavaScript code. It reads our JavaScript and it executes it. So if I open up JavaScript engines in Wikipedia, are there multiple JavaScript engines? Well, yeah, there are. For example, Google Chrome uses something called the V8 JavaScript engine. SpiderMonkey is used by the Firefox browser. And then there's other things like JavaScript Core that is the one used by Apple in its Safari browser. So there's different JavaScript engines that can read our JavaScript code. But hold on there. We didn't really answer the question, are we able to run JavaScript outside of the browser? And this is where Node comes in. But before we get into Node, we have to talk about some of the key moments that led to Node. Because these 4 key moments are what caused the world to take notice of Node. Because up until now, we know that a browser runs a JavaScript engine. But what if we don't have a browser? We wanted to run JavaScript on our computers. We need to solve that problem. Well, let's take a history lesson. 1995, that's a big year because that's the year that the Netscape browser introduced to us JavaScript. Brendan Eich, that used to work there, essentially developed a new programming language, JavaScript, that allows us to manipulate and program things on the web. Now in 1996, Netscape had a great idea. With their version 3 of their Netscape Navigator, they introduced something called Netscape Livewire, a way to create dynamic pages using server-side JavaScript. Hey, we've heard that term before. As a matter of fact, we can even see the press release when they announced it in 1996. With the release of 3.0 version Netscape web servers, Netscape Livewire is fully integrated into web servers. Blah, 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 blah. Allows us to do essentially server-side JavaScript. But you know what? Let's forget about Livewire because it was ahead of its time and it just didn't really work. Anyway, everything went along. JavaScript was on the front end, was on the browser, and then 2008 rolls around. And this was a critical period. Why? Because Google announced something new, and that was the Chrome browser. And this symbol that you see here, that you've seen before, is what was critical. It was called the V8 engine, a new JavaScript engine. You see, in 2008, it was a pivotal moment for the web. The idea of Web 2.0 started being talked about. The idea of having websites like Flickr, like Gmail, that were interactive. It showed the world that modern experiences on the web could happen. It's more than just pages, just HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript. When Chrome released their new browser, it allowed JavaScript to run really fast, really performant. It allowed users to have really good experiences on websites because it was such a good JavaScript engine. As a matter of fact, it's the reason that Chrome browsers are so popular now. But because we can now run JavaScript a lot faster on the web, and the V8 engine was so powerful, the concept that didn't really work back in 1996 with Livewire, well, a year later in 2009, Ryan Dahl created Node.js. The idea was simple. Can we take this V8 engine that runs JavaScript really, really fast on the browser and just run it outside of the browser? Because that's the question we're trying to solve, right? We started the course with how do you run JavaScript? And up until now, we can run it on the browser. But if I told you to run it on your computer without a browser, well, before Node.js, that would have been a little bit tricky. As a matter of fact, if you want, you can even go on YouTube, search for Ryan Dahl, original Node.js presentation, and still see the presentation where he released Node.js to the world in 2009. It's a really interesting talk and a bit of a history lesson. Now, Ryan Dahl had a bit of luck on his side because there were more and more JavaScript developers in the world working on web applications, but we now have the ability with Node to say, hey, can we run JavaScript outside of the browser? Maybe we can do what Python, PHP, or any other programming language can do, which is run code on things like servers. And because there were so many JavaScript developers already, Node was able to create this idea of a full stack developer. A full stack developer is somebody that can work on the web, but also in the world of, let's say, backend servers, microservices. And there you have it. Node was born in 2009, and now, well, it's a big player in the programming world. And if you see here, we see that Node.js is a JavaScript runtime built on Chrome 8's V8 JavaScript engine. All right, we know what Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine is, but what is a runtime? Let's learn about that in the next video. Welcome back. So we just learned what Node is, kind of. We're still working there, but the other piece of information that we need to solve is what is a JavaScript runtime? Because Node is a JavaScript runtime. It's not a programming language, it's not a framework, it's a runtime. So let's demystify that. What is a runtime? Now, this idea of a runtime, we're going to deep dive into it a little bit later in the course, so I'm just going to skim the surface. But you can think of it as a JavaScript environment. an environment that allows us to run JavaScript as well as do some extra stuff. Now, the way Node works is that it has the V8 engine, which, as we learned, makes our JavaScript code run really efficiently. And every time the Google engineers upgrade the V8 engine, which is very often, well, Node automatically gets faster and faster with each improvement in the V8 engine. So automatic performance boost just by that. But in order for it to do a lot more than just read JavaScript, it might want to do different things. Maybe read files, maybe access databases, maybe just run some things that aren't part of the V8 engine, aren't part of JavaScript. And that's where this libuv comes in. You see, Node.js in a simplified form is simply a way for us to give a JavaScript file to the Node.js runtime. It's going to go through the V8 engine, it's going to read the JavaScript, and anytime it sees something that maybe isn't part of JavaScript, it's going to communicate with this libuv library with a cool dinosaur logo. But what does it mean? Well, we can just simply Google libuv. Libuv is a multi-platform C library that provides support for asynchronous I/O based on event loops. Don't worry, we'll cover that later in the course. It's essentially a library that allows us to do some really neat features with Node.js that make it great for things like web servers, things that we're going to build throughout the course. If we actually go to the Node.js GitHub repo, which anybody can access because it's open source, and we go into the source folder, you'll actually see that at the bottom, we're going to access the README that says Node.js C++ codebase. And you can read about this if you really want to dive deep. But essentially, what Node and Ryan Dahl did was combine the V8 engine and this libuv, which is written in C++. V8 engine is written with JavaScript and C++, and he created the bindings between them so that they can communicate. So that whenever they encounter something that maybe needs asynchronous I/O, well, then we hand it over to the libuv. Now, I know this is kind of confusing, and we're going to dive deeper into this topic, but that's what Node is. A JavaScript runtime is an environment for us to run JavaScript that gives us a little bit more than just the V8 engine. Now, let me ask you another question. Is a web browser a JavaScript runtime? Pause the video and think about it. Based on what you learned, is JavaScript a runtime? Well, let's do a quick search here. Is web browser a JavaScript runtime? Wow, good sentencing on my part. All right, so we go to Stack Overflow. Looks like this person has the exact same question as us. And if we go to the answer, we see a browser contains a JavaScript engine. Hey, we know what that means. And the engine implements a JavaScript runtime, which includes call stack, heap, and event loop. Don't worry, we're going to learn about those soon. The browser also usually includes a set of APIs that augment the JavaScript runtime and make asynchronous blah, 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 blah. In a sense, yes, the web browser is a JavaScript runtime, right? If we go to our console, we can actually run code that isn't part of JavaScript. For example, console.log isn't actually part of the JavaScript specification. It's just something that the browsers allow us to do. Things like alert, well, those are very web specific. The browser implements this alert feature that we can use. And all of these are part of what we call the window object in the browser. The window object is a set of tools that the browsers give us that we can use that aren't part of JavaScript, but allow us to have multiple functionalities. So it's a JavaScript runtime. Remember, the V8 engine combined with some extra functionality. In the same sense, with Node.js, we have that functionality, except Because it's not a browser, in Node.js, if you do window, you're going to get an error. In Node.js, we have something called global instead of the window. But if I do it here, I get an error because the browser doesn't know about global. Don't worry, we're going to dive into this specific thing in the next video. But before I keep talking, I want to go back to what we've learned up until now. How do you run JavaScript? Well, you need a runtime. You need some sort of an JavaScript engine and a runtime to be able to run the code. And that's what Node does. So how do you run JavaScript outside of the browser? You need to download a set of features so that your computer understands what JavaScript is, what you want to do. Node is, in a way, just a set of tools for us to write our applications. That application uses the V8 engine to read the JavaScript, and anytime there's something that requires some sort of things like worker threads, event queues, event loops, again, something we'll cover later on, well, we use the libuv library, and Ryan Dahl created these bindings for us that communicates between V8 and libuv. So that now we're able to write JavaScript, gets read by the V8 engine, and then gets sent back to libuv. But we don't have to worry about what's underneath the hood. We can just run JavaScript code. And by the way, this is exactly how it works with other programming languages as well. For example, if you wanted to run Python, my computer doesn't know what Python is. Yes, maybe it might be pre-installed on my computer when I bought it, but most likely, if I write Python and throw it to the computer is going to say, "Who are you? I don't even know what that means." So just like we will in the next couple of videos, we need to actually install Node.js so that we can download these tools to run JavaScript outside of the browser. In the same way, if I wanted to, let's say, code in Python, I'd have to go to the python.org website and then download Python, or the Python, what we call interpreter, so that my computer can read Python code. Now let's take a break here. I know we're covering a lot. Your brain might be a mush right now, but don't worry, everything's gonna fall into place bit by bit. For now, grab a cup of coffee and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, I lied. We'll have one more video for you before we start diving in. Now, one of the things with Node is that it's constantly updating. As a matter of fact, I just modified the numbers here, but the version of Node you're gonna see, well, it really depends on when you watch the videos. But our goal is to keep this course up to date. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna build a project, and the project's going to work as long as you have Node 12 or higher. And if you're watching the video right now, the latest version of Node is much higher than 12, so you should be all good. But what we're gonna do is do the projects in the Node version that is 12 or higher. And then at the very end, once we finished everything, we're gonna show you how to update your projects because that's something you're gonna do in real life. And we're gonna use tools like NVM to show you how you might wanna upgrade as new Node versions come out, which they come out very often. So wait for that until the end of the course. For now, as long as we have Node version 12 or higher, which we'll show you how to install soon, well, you're all set then. All right, let's get started.